Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Today I'm joined by Erin Covey, who leads coverage of the House for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Erin's been on the show a handful of times, including just a few weeks ago before the election to give us a preview of the toss-up races in the House, which are those, again, that'll ultimately decide which party has a controlling majority. We're still waiting on those results a full week after the election, with votes still being counted in a handful of states and a dozen House races waiting to be called by the AP and others. By the time this releases, we may have the answer to who controls the House, but for the time being, I'm joined by Erin Covey now. Thanks so much, Erin, for coming back on the show. We really appreciate you coming on as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. So you're probably getting this question over and over again this week. Can you explain to our listeners why some states still are tabulating votes at this point? I know that California's been catching most of the heat for taking so long, but they are certainly not the only ones. So what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that a lot of these states out west use mail-in ballots. And so those just take longer to count and to process. And every state does it differently. States have different laws that determine the speed at which they're able to count results. And then even certain counties within states, like some counties in California are slower than others at tabulating the ballots. And so this is no surprise. It always takes forever in California. If California were a swing state, this would be a real issue because then we wouldn't know the presidential results for days. But right now, they only have the House to worry about there. So that is a large part of the reason we still do not officially know control of the House at this point. But there's, of course, other states that we're also waiting on. Arizona still has places they need to count, and then Alaska as well. And for Alaska, which is, of course, an incredibly rural state, that presents an added challenge of just physically getting the ballots to the places where they can be counted. And so there are just all these layers that these states have to go through because they largely do vote by mail rather than in-person voting, and like some of the other states that are able to count faster. So it's no surprise. And, you know, as a part of that, folks who watch elections regularly will notice that there's often trends in terms of the partisanship of the way ballots are or not in the way ballots are counted, but in the way that results come in. So oftentimes in these California races, the initial results look pretty good for Republicans, and that's because they're counting the votes that were cast on election day first. And then they go back and start doing the ballots that were cast by mail, and those tend to benefit Democrats more. And so this shift towards either party is just a quirk of the process. It's perfectly normal. And that's why you have to wait a while to call these races, because we don't know how the outstanding votes are going to break. We can make guesses based on previous cycles, but, you know, as we know from this cycle, the way that people cast their ballots has really changed over the last couple of years as states have changed their laws and as the Republican Party and Republican Party leaders made a much more concerted effort this cycle to encourage their voters to vote early, which also kind of changed some of the longstanding patterns. And so that's why the AP and the major networks that call these races have to be really cautious before they can officially project who the winner is.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see just how like in-person early voting was way up, but like overall early voting wasn't. I think it was down by between like 10 to 15 million. So we don't like to wait for anything in our modern society, but sadly it seems like we're at least going to have to wait a little bit longer. We're not going to hold you to this, Erin, because it really doesn't seem like anybody knows. So whatever you say here, we're not gonna, I promise nobody's coming after you. But when do you think we're going to know? Do you think it's going to be soon, by the time this releases, maybe by the weekend? What do you think?
So currently there are 12 uncalled House races if we're looking at the AP calls. And Republicans have 216 seats and Democrats have 207 seats. So that means Republicans are just 2 seats short of a majority, which is 218 seats, of course. So I'm thinking because of that, we'll probably know by the end of the week. And it is very, very likely that Republicans will continue to hold the House. But the question is, what will the size of their majority be? And I think it's also safe to say at this point that it's going to be a very similarly sized majority to what we currently have. And it's been interesting seeing House Republican leaders taking a victory lap, which is absolutely fair. But I saw a quote from Speaker Johnson today where he was talking about Trump's coattails in a lot of House races, which is not necessarily true. In fact, it does seem like we saw House Democrats overperform Harris in a lot of places and House Republicans underperform Trump. And so we're not seeing, despite the fact that there was a significant shift towards Republicans at the presidential level in a lot of these states, particularly the non-competitive states like New York, like Florida, like Texas, that has not had a lot of rippling consequences at the House level, surprisingly. And so I don't think there were actually as many coattails as long of coattails for Trump as you might expect, just looking at the presidential results. And what I'm looking at right now is that likely Republicans will have a majority of 220 to 222 seats. They currently have a majority of 221 seats. So that means effectively things are staying the same.
Cool. And last time we had you on, Erin, we talked a lot about the toss-up races. Again, for listeners, those are the closest races that at every level of government, whether we're talking about presidential, Senate, House, whatever it might be, those are the races that kind of decide the balance of power. They're those that we expect to be the closest. Of these remaining races that AP hasn't called, how many of them are toss-up races? Like, of the remaining ones, which are you watching most closely that might be the tipping point here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't actually know that number off the top of my head. A majority of those 12 outstanding races were races that we had rated as a toss-up. So just running through the list right now, we have Alaska's at-large district held by Democratic Congresswoman Mary Peltola. We have 1, 2, 3 districts in California that were rated as toss-ups. We have a district in Arizona that we had rated as a toss-up, a district in Iowa, Maine, Ohio, and Oregon. So actually, yeah, the vast majority of these 12 uncalled races were rated as toss-ups by us. There's a couple of outliers, and that includes California's 21st district, held by Jim Costa, which we actually had rated as safety. And this is a little bit closer than we certainly were expecting, though I will say Jim Costa does kind of have a history of underperforming in his district. But even if it did move quite a bit to the right, he is still on track to win. And I don't think he was ever in any real danger, though it's not surprising that he is underperforming by quite a bit considering his history. And then the other non-toss-up races that have yet to be called are Josh Harder's seat in California's 9th district. This is another seat where the Democrat Harder has a 4-point lead at this point, but there's enough outstanding ballots here that the networks and the AP have yet to call it. And then California's 47th district, held by outgoing Representative Katie Porter. It looks like Democrats are on track to hold that open seat, which we had rated as lean D. But again, we're still waiting for enough ballots there that race hasn't been called either.
Whether it's this batch of races that we're still waiting on or those that have already been decided, could we expect any recounts or legal challenges to come up in the coming weeks?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of races that will probably go to a recount. One of them is Ohio's 9th district. This is a district that has not been called, despite the fact that almost all votes have been counted, according to the AP at least, over 95%. And the Democratic Congresswoman there, Marcy Kaptur, currently leads by 1/3 of a percentage point, or about 1,200 votes. That is a narrow enough lead that would then trigger Ohio's law, which would force it into an automatic recount, which is why the networks and the AP have yet to call this race, because it is going to go to a recount. Some states require an automatic recount if the margin is close enough. Other states don't, and it's incumbent on the loser to request a recount. So we might see other recounts in other races. It does look like in Maine's 2nd district, where the Democratic Congressman Golden, again, has a really narrow lead, but we have most votes counted. So it's pretty safe to say that he will continue to be the congressman in that district. But because it is so narrow, his Republican opponent, Austin Terrio, has called for a recount. And they also have to conduct the ranked choice tabulation in this race as well, because Golden fell just short of getting an outright majority, and Maine uses ranked choice voting in their election. So I won't bore y'all with the details of that. But basically that process has to finish, and then a recount can happen. Now, despite all of this, we still all largely expect Golden will be fine. But because of that, most of the networks and the AP have yet to call that race. And then Iowa's 1st district is another really close one right now. The Republican congresswoman there, Marionette Miller Meeks, leads by about a fifth of a point, or 731 votes. Wow. So that is a race that could go to a recount, even though we expect Miller Meeks to win that race. It is yet to be called because of that uncertainty there.
Very cool. Lots of close races to keep an eye on there. Again, by the time we release this, we might know. Sounds like it might not be till the end of the weekend. So listeners, we'll have some of this information from Cook linked in our show notes, as well as some stuff from Ballotpedia. But Erin, I'm wondering, obviously, we still got to wait for the dust to settle for a lot of the analysis to take place when it comes to how folks voted, how counties shifted from 2020, all that good stuff, right? But I'm wondering what trends are sticking out to you for this cycle in the House. I know that you mentioned a couple as it relates to like split ticket voting, or, local Democrats running ahead of Harris, or House Republicans running behind Trump. But what comes to mind there for you?
Yeah, I think the impact of split ticket voting will be a really interesting conversation to have. And it's something that we can't fully know the impacts of now because we don't have access to results on the granular level to see how these districts voted at the presidential level and in other statewide offices. But luckily, there are some states that have released precinct level results faster. And so there's some folks on Twitter who I follow, like Drew Savicki, who have done the work of crunching the numbers and figuring out the presidential results in some of these districts. So that can give us the beginning of an idea of how much split ticket voting there really was. And I do think I want to note, it's easy to look at these results and think, oh, wow, a lot of voters split their ballots. But it also might be that a lot of voters just voted for the presidential race and didn't vote in the congressional race. And you can see that when you're looking at the share of the vote that members of Congress got versus the presidential nominees. So particularly in Senate races, from what we've seen, it wasn't so much that these Democratic senators in swing states were running ahead of Harris. It was much more so that the Republican nominees were running behind Trump. And a lot of Trump voters were not voting for the Republican nominees, which hampered their ability to flip those seats. So I think maybe it's more of a conversation of Republican underperformance rather than Democratic overperformance, at least when we're looking at vote share. But it does look like, overall, there was enough split ticket voting to matter in a lot of these really close races at the House level. And that largely benefited Democrats in the House. And we've seen that by the fact that there are these districts that it looks like Trump is on track to win, that Democrats were still able to hold. Going into this election, there were 16 Republicans who held seats that Biden won in 2020, and there were only 5 Democrats who won seats that Trump won in 2020. So the number of Republicans in Biden seats outnumbered the number of Democrats in Trump seats. I think we're going to have a reverse situation going into 2026, where there's going to be more Democrats in seats that Trump won in 2024, and probably not that many Republicans in seats that Harris won. And so one of those Republicans will probably be, well, we can say it's Don Bacon in Nebraska's 2nd district. He's in a seat that Harris looks like is on track to win by about 4 points. But aside from that, a lot of these Republicans who were in Biden seats before are now in Trump seats, it looks like. And there's Democrats who before were sitting in Biden seats who are now in Trump seats. And some of those Democrats are likely to include folks like Don Davis in North Carolina, Kristen McDonald-Rivet in Michigan, Vicente Gonzalez in Texas, Tom Suozzi in New York. And so there's going to be more Democrats in these kind of crossover districts than Republicans probably. So that's one trend that I am looking out for. I also think it'll be really interesting to see how gains that Trump has made in some of these more urban parts of the country or more heavily Latino parts of the country will translate to down ballot Republican success. Because I'm not sure how much Republicans are going to be able to go after some of these seats when it's not clear how much of Trump's appeal can be replicated by a generic Republican candidate. So that'll be something interesting that I'm taking a look at. One really obvious example here is Grace Meng's seat. She represents a seat in Queens in New York. This is a seat that Harris is only winning by about 5 points, it looks like. However, it looks like Grace Meng is on track to comfortably win re-election by over 20 points. And so if she's running that far ahead of Harris, it's not clear to me if a strong Republican candidate down ballot even might be able to replicate Trump's margin there.
That makes sense. And boy, are you going to be busy these next couple of months analyzing everything. So we're going to be excited to follow along and see what you guys learned. But let's end with some hypothetical scenarios, one of our favorite things to do here on the show. As we've established, it does look like Republicans are edging closer to retaining control of the House and gaining federal trifecta status. Again, for listeners, that means that they have control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. What implications does that have from your perspective for how they might govern?
Yeah, so I think the fact that House Republicans are going to have a really narrow majority will make it difficult for them again, though probably not quite as difficult as it was this past session. And that's because they will be operating in a trifecta government rather than having a narrow majority while dealing with a Democratic administration and a Democratic-held Senate. So it probably will be less chaotic than it was in the 118th Congress in terms of kind of Republican infighting and struggles to pass legislation. But I think that's still going to be a dynamic because Republicans will have such a narrow majority. And that could empower some of the rabble-rousers in the more Freedom Caucus wing of the party to hold legislation up, just because it could only take a couple of them to keep Republicans from passing legislation in the House. So I think having a trifecta obviously will be helpful for passing a lot of Trump's agenda through, but the majorities are narrow enough in the House and even in the Senate to a certain extent that I'm not sure how much of that will be blocked. And I think an interesting initial test of this will be if any of Trump's nominees for cabinet positions have any trouble getting confirmed in the Senate. And while I don't think that will be the case for most of them, there are some maybe more controversial picks that could have more trouble just because there are still folks in the Senate like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Bill Cassidy, Todd Young, who have been more willing to push back against Trump and the more far-right elements of the party in the past. So I'll be curious to see how much Republicans are able to get done. But, I do think this will obviously help them get the Trump agenda through. And, I think that then we'll be living with the scenario where we'll be wondering how much voters are going to react to that and whether voters are going to punish them for that in the same way they did in the 2018 midterms.
Makes a lot of sense. So let's take a look at the flip side. What if Democrats pull off what seems like an unlikely comeback here and win the House? How might that affect Trump's agenda?
Yeah, I think, again, that is really, really unlikely. And I can go through specifically why we think that's the case. Basically, Democrats would have to turn around Republican leads in several districts that are uncalled, but where Republicans are at a pretty strong place. And so they would have to managed to hold probably Alaska's seat where the Republicans in the lead, California's 41st district, California's 45th district, California's 13th district, Arizona's 6th district, Iowa's 1st district. These are all seats where Republicans are in the lead. And while Democrats are in a pretty strong position in California's 13th district and 45th district, I would say, the rest of these seats look really difficult for Democrats to win at this point. So that means they won't be at the 218 seats they would need for a majority, and they'll probably end up somewhere around 215. But if they were to get a majority, that would obviously, they would be able to block a significant portion of Trump's agenda. Now, of course, there's a lot that he can do through executive power. So it would only work to a certain extent, but that would be a huge roadblock for Trump.
All right, well, we'll see if the AP will beat us to the results before we release this episode. But Erin Covey of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, we always appreciate you coming on the show. So thank you again for bringing us up to speed.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode as we continue to break down what we learned this cycle and what to look out for next year as a new administration comes to power. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.